Good afternoon and welcome to the Midday News. Here's what we have in the bulletin. National COVID-19 Vaccination Operationalization Task Force makes recommendation to boost reactions from stakeholders in the education sector to resumption of face-to-face classes. And Arnett Gardens appoints new coach ahead of next season's Jamaica Premier League. I'm Anthony Lugg, and here are the details. Up first this afternoon, the National COVID-19 Vaccination Operationalization Task Force has recommended that persons be allowed to take the second dose of the AstraZeneca vaccine earlier than the due date to prevent expiration of doses currently in stock. The task force was appointed last month to provide the government with recommendations to improve the COVID-19 vaccination programs.
And they support the fact that if you have the vaccines, if the vaccines are going to go to waste, it will be better to allow persons to come in a little bit early and take their shots. The work with the private sector vaccination initiative has borne fruit, and the Ministry of Health is onboarding a number of private doctors. The target is to get up to 200. Our interaction with the Medical Association of Jamaica is that we could even exceed 200 with a little bit of luck. And that would expand considerably the number of persons involved in the delivery of vaccination, the vaccination process.
The National COVID-19 Vaccine Operationalization Task Force comprises members from various industries. And starting today, 100 medical doctors will begin administering COVID-19 vaccines in their private practices free of cost. Shamela Pullen reports.
Medical doctors in Jamaica have long been calling for the government to allow them to take the COVID-19 vaccines into their private offices to administer to their patients. After weeks of making this appeal, Health Minister Dr. Christopher Tufton says it is now a reality.
Based on their availability and willingness, they will be offered or provided the vaccines, and they will offer those vaccines free of cost to their patients. Each of them, of course, these doctors will have a cadre of patients that they treat, and they will be able to offer the vaccines.
Dr. Tufton says the numbers could change as necessary or by the willingness of more doctors. He says the medical doctors were selected based on several factors.
These are doctors who are registered with the Medical Council of Jamaica and are approved by the health department in the respective parishes in which they operate, and would be supervised, oversight provided by, of course, the public health through the parish offices and under the guidelines of the immunization regulations.
The health minister said the government is trying to expand the COVID-19 vaccine sites across the country to get more persons to take the jab. It is hoped that through this initiative, the vaccine rate, which is now at about 12%, will increase to meet the WHO 40% target.
And we're hoping that Jamaicans will take advantage of the additional outlets that are going to be made available, and where they need advice from their physician, they can, of course, have those discussions to guide them in terms of the decision.
Shamela Pullen, TVJ News.
And the COVID-19 positivity rate is now at 7.5%, a 0.8% decline. It comes as the country recorded 50 new cases of the virus from 748 test samples. The overall case count stands at 88,530. There was also a further reduction in hospitalizations. 297 people have been hospitalized with a respiratory illness, down by 43 people. 18 people are critically ill, while 35 are severely ill. 238 people have recovered in the last 24 hours, bringing the island's recovery rate to 57,182. There are 28,553 active cases on the island. In the meantime, 8 additional deaths have been recorded for the period August 25 to October 25. The death toll is now 2,192. And we go now to reactions from stakeholders in the education sector as some primary schools are slated to resume face-to-face classes come next month. O'Shane Masters is here with that update. O'Shane?
Thanks, Anthony. Well, we know that some 376 primary schools will resume face-to-face classes come November 8, as was announced by Prime Minister Andrew Holness last evening. But while there have been positive reactions to the announcement, concerns abound. President of the Jamaica Association of Principals of Secondary Schools, Linvan Wright, is criticizing the government for what he calls inequity.
When you check the way businesses have been dealt with in relation to education, what we are picking up is that many of these decisions are more economic. And I'm saying it seems to me that if we don't start looking at not just capital in terms of monetary capital and whether people can make profit or whether profits are going to be hemorrhaged, because we're saving businesses. What we are not doing in my mind is that we are not saving our children. And I'm saying if health is a concern, everybody needs to take the beating.
Now, he's also concerned about the decision to allow private institutions to resume face-to-face classes while some public schools remain closed. Mr. Wright believes the approach which was implemented for the tourism sector could have been used to allow public schools to resume in-person teaching and learning, a point which opposition spokesperson on education, Dr. Angela Brown-Burke, agrees.
What we really have to do is to make sure that the Ministry of Education, while balancing the health concerns, make sure that education is in fact a priority. Remember, we're talking about a very unequal system long before the pandemic. And if we are to recover now and make sure that we don't just get back to where we were with the inequities before, but that we do something and make sure that those inequities are reversed, it requires intentional action and it requires a sense of urgency. It requires looking at education as if it's a business too big to fail.
Another point of contention raised is reaching the vaccination rate of 65% per institution before face-to-face classes can resume in secondary schools. Dr. Brown-Burke yesterday raised that question with Prime Minister Andrew Holness.
We're going to get another set, and I don't want to tell you how much that is, but it's a large amount, larger than what we're going to get now. And we could easily ramp up particular schools up to 65. And as schools reach the target, the plan is to get them face-to-face. So yes, it can be done rapidly, and I can foresee it being done rapidly. The only obstacle would be for parents who resist their children getting vaccinated. That's the only issue. I'm seeing that the amount that we're getting is in this year, the amount of the Pfizer, we're getting it this year. But I won't say whether it is November or December.
In the meantime, students with disabilities are eager to return to physical classes. As you'll hear in this report from Sandy Williams, students with disabilities have been facing challenges.
Like other students, children with disabilities too are affected by the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on schools. Their situation is compounded by the fact that engaged learning is critical and the transition to online classes is difficult for some. The most common complaint is the lack of devices for students.
Our parents will share, their own frustration, because it is not easy for, just like any other parent, you're having to work, for those who work from home, and you have to be at school, because school is very engaging when a child is there. And although it works for some persons, it doesn't work for everybody, depending on the workload that the parent would carry. And if they are not only the main breadwinner, but the only person, the only adult in the home, it makes for greater challenges.
Executive Director at the Jamaica Council for Persons with Disabilities, Dr. Christine Hendricks, laments that several students from the deaf community have not been engaged in virtual classes.
The deaf community is still on a drive to see how they can acquire as many devices as possible, because students without the device are largely unengaged. There are some persons or students who would have had to be utilizing their parents' devices, their phones, sometimes sharing between two children, which is very difficult. And when parents, for those who still had to go to work, when parents went to work, then there was no connectivity or no engagement at all.
And because of the challenges, the community of people with disabilities is desperate for the resumption of in-person classes, a hope that is now a reality, given that the government announced the resumption of face-to-face classes for some primary schools and for secondary school students sitting exams.
I know that the schools are looking forward to getting back into the classroom, just to make sure that the students are engaged again. So much relearning will have to take place. But I know that as a country we're resilient, as a people we're resilient, and I'm sure that we will move forward.
Sandy Williams, TVJ News.
It's time for a break. Stay with us. More stories when we return. Welcome back to the Midday News, and thanks for staying with us. We go now to a developing story. The trial date for the two former PETROJAM executives has been pushed back until May 2022 after the prosecution indicated that there was new information which will see them filing new charges against the men. The order for indictment include charges of fraudulent conversion, aiding and abetting fraudulent conversion, conspiracy to defraud, and 1 count each of obtaining money under false pretense. Former chairman Dr. Percival Behadu Singh was initially charged with 12 counts of obtaining money under false pretense, while former PETROJAM General Manager Floyd Grinley was charged with 8 counts of aiding and abetting as well as obtaining money under the false pretense. Their bails were extended so they are allowed to return to the United States, where they both reportedly live until their trial date on May 9. And we go now to news where the opposition leader Mark Golding is insisting that the government should not be making changes to the Emergency Powers Act at a time when there are constitutional questions about the use of states of emergency. Mr. Golding made the comments in Parliament yesterday before the changes to the act were passed. Vashon Brown has more.
The government has been insisting that both the Emergency Powers Act and the Emergency Public Security Act, which were enacted in 1938 and 1939 respectively, are in need of reform. But the opposition leader says he has fundamental concerns. Firstly, he argues that the constitutional validity of the government's use of states of emergency in crime fighting is being tested in the courts.
The government has appealed a Supreme Court decision that essentially declared that the use of the state of emergency device in that way is unconstitutional. And the government has not attempted to impose any states of emergency since that court ruling. There is also another case before the court, this one challenging the constitutionality of the state of emergency in St. James. That case has not yet been heard, but is scheduled to be heard in the Constitutional Court over 3 days in mid-December.
In light of those court cases, he argues that it is concerning that the government has brought the bills to Parliament, especially with what he calls lingering constitutional questions. He says this course of action by the government shows a lack of respect for the separation of powers doctrine.
Parliament should first see what the Court of Appeal has to say about this important matter, and indeed what the Constitutional Court has to say about it in the other case I referred to. To be amending the Emergency Powers Act now, an enactment which is integral to and will be impacted by the court challenge to the government's use of the state of emergency, is, in my opinion, premature and presumptuous.
But Justice Minister Delwar Chuck fired back, arguing that he was disappointed by the opposition leader's comments.
But with due respect, Leader of the Opposition, you have completely misinterpreted the case of Douglas, that where Justice Bertram Morrison emphatically said that he cannot rule on the constitutionality of the state of emergency because only a tribunal of 3 can consider the constitutional. And he said it.
The government, Madam Speaker, has a duty to protect the Constitution as well. And if in the execution of that duty, we see anything that could suggest a breach of the Constitution or an imperfection in the law, it is our duty. We shouldn't have to wait on a court to tell us. it is our duty to act in the defense and protection of the people's right and the Constitution.
After the debate, the changes to the bills were passed. Vashon Brown, TVJ News.
And it's time now for the Business Minute with O'Shane Masters.
A financial analyst is predicting a turnaround in the local equities market following a decline in recent months. Vice President of Strategy and Research at NCB Capital Markets, Anya Walker, gave an outlook for the market.
We had some gains early in the year, and Q3 we saw a downturn in terms of the prices of stock. And though it's down year to date, though it's down in Q3 year to date, it would have still made marginal gains. In terms of the stock market performance for Q4, what we're looking at is that we anticipate a better outturn for Q4 with the relaxation of the restrictions, although the slow of earnings that we will see in the coming weeks will likely reflect the lockdowns of Q3. But Q4, we anticipate a stronger performance.
And the Managing Director of the Jamaica Stock Exchange, Marlene Street Forest, says there have been mixed results on the stock exchange.
When you look at the last quarter to this quarter, we have seen that all statistics really recorded improvement in all markets. And the statistics that we are talking about is volume traded, value traded, and number of transactions. So while prices might be down, it is made up for in terms of the volume and value traded.
They were both speaking yesterday at a media briefing. And that's it for the Business Minute. I'm O'Shane Masters.
And we go now to a look at a preview of what's coming up in this evening's health report.
In this evening's health report, we look at persons who are immunocompromised and COVID-19 vaccines.
So if you're vaccinated, for example, and you have an immunocompromised relative at home, even though you might not need to take the precautions for yourself, you should be thinking of that relative, and you should still put yourself under a certain level of discipline for the protection of the person, just in case you happen to harbor any of the organisms and then take them back home with you. So in the same respect, I'm thinking that the person who is immunocompromised can't fight. Even if they have the vaccine, it will help them to mount a response, but they can't count on that response.
That's the health report in Primetime News at 7. And now for today's healthy living tip. Exercise. Eat healthy. Take vitamins or supplements. Spend time outside, reduce stress when possible, and practice good personal hygiene.
And for a look at the top regional and international stories, here's Sandy Williams.
In the region, the 15-member Caribbean Community CARICOM grouping is calling on leaders attending the United Nations Climate Change Conference, COP26, to close the emissions gap, scale up finance, particularly for the most vulnerable, and agree on rules to guide parties to progressively increase and demonstrate highest ambition. The Guyana-based CARICOM Secretariat has released the text of the CARICOM Declaration on Climate Change adopted by CARICOM environment ministers, who have warned that the region faces a climate emergency and unavoidable loss and damage. On the international scene, according to a report from the United Nations, the world is facing a disastrous temperature rise at least 2.7 degrees Celsius if countries fail to strengthen their climate pledges. Tuesday's publication warns that countries' current pledges would reduce carbon by only about 7.5% by 2030, far less than 45% cut scientists say is needed to limit global temperature rises to 1.5 degrees Celsius, which is the aim of the COP26 summit that opens in Glasgow this Sunday. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres has described the findings as a thundering wake-up call to world leaders, while experts called for drastic action against fossil fuel companies. And that's the top regional and international stories. I'm Sandy Williams.
We head now to a quick break. When we return, we'll have your Midday Sports Report. Bernardo Brown is standing by.
Welcome back. It's now time for your Midday Sports. Former national player Paul Teagat Davis will take charge of Arnett Gardens Football Club for the next season of the Jamaica Premier League, following reports from the Gleaner that he will replace Alex Thomas. Davis's appointment comes just months after he was relieved of similar duties with Mount Pleasant Academy after a sluggish start to the truncated Jamaica Premier League season. Thomas left the position of head coach of Arnett Gardens recently after 2 seasons with the club. Arnett finished 9th in the recently concluded 2021 JPL. Davis previously spent 3 seasons with Arnett Gardens from 2010 until resigning in November of 2012. Cricket now, world number 1 England made it 2 wins in 2 at the Men's T20 World Cup after beating Bangladesh by 8 wickets in Abu Dhabi today. Batting first, Bangladesh posted 124 for 9 with Mushfiqur Rahim top scoring with 29. In fact, only 4 other batsmen reached double figures, with captain Mohammedullah and Nasim Ahmed both getting 19. Timon Mills claimed 3 for 27 for England, while Liam Livingstone and Moeen Ali had 2 wickets each. In their chase, Jason Roy, playing his 50th T20 international, led the way for England with 61, while Dawid Malan made 28 not out to take England to their second victory at 126 for 2. Like the West Indies, Bangladesh have now lost their 2 opening games, with the 2 teams playing each other on Friday. Victoria Premier Daniel Andrews said his government will not apply for travel permits to allow unvaccinated tennis players to compete at the Australian Open in the state after Prime Minister Scott Morrison indicated they would allow those players into the country. Morrison said earlier on Wednesday that unvaccinated players would be free to compete at the Grand Slam after undergoing a 2-week COVID-19 quarantine, provided that Victoria, which hosts the tournament in Melbourne, applied for permits for them. Andrews said, however, his state would make no such applications. Australia's borders have been effectively sealed for 18 months due to the COVID-19 pandemic, though authorities approved travel exemptions for special cases. And that's it for your Midday Sports Report. It's back to you, Anthony.
Thank you very much, Renardo. And that's the Midday News. I'm Anthony Lugg. Join us at 7 for Primetime News. On behalf of the news, sports, and production teams, good afternoon.